Hi, and welcome to the presentation on business management and data. Today I'm going to explore the question, how can I change business with data? And this is a question that many MBA students and many MBA graduates are asking themselves, especially considering the current business environment where a lot of buzzwords are getting tossed around. You hear big data, analytics, petabytes of information being generated every minute, every hour. And there's quite a bit of hype out there that can be distracting and often very intimidating. So this presentation is an effort to help people who don't necessarily have a technical background, but have an intense curiosity about data. Um, with that being said, I just want to give one disclaimer before we move on. This presentation was originally developed for the Business Analytics and Big Data Club of Harvard Business School. So there's some references to HBS throughout that I think ultimately enrich the presentation, but please forgive me if they seem to be a little bit repetitive. But I just wanted to depart with that understanding. So with that being said, I guess the other big disclaimer that I should give is that this is not going to be a presentation about what kind of technical skills you need to develop to be a data-driven manager or to lead a data-driven organization. Certainly, there are a lot of resources out there that can help you find, identify, and find individuals with those skills. But this is more a presentation about, how do you reorient yourself and your view of the world and your view of business to accommodate what's now possible with data. So with that being said, I want to start off with what I think is the critical first step in engaging with data as a business manager, is that you essentially need to see the world differently. And I say see the world differently because the world with data is different. It's a world with unprecedented possibilities, and to use data in an efficient, profit maximizing way, revenue increasing way, you need to be creative and you need to understand what can now be translated into and from data. So I'm going to take you through a few examples of organizations and people who I think have done this really, really well. And the first thing that they've done, I think that I find very impressive, is they've changed the way it's always been done. Essentially, they looked at a process and said, okay, here's how we've done it, but now we have some data that can help us out. And I think that we can fundamentally alter this process to produce something that's bigger and better than before. So a great example of this is the show House of Cards, which is available on Netflix and has had a stellar first and second season. And a lot of fans might not know this, but this series came about actually because Netflix made a tremendous bet on the data that they had available. Essentially what happened is the director and Kevin Spacey, who's the actor that anchors the show, they wanted to produce an American version of a show that British show, House of Cards, that was already available. But they wanted to do it in an innovative way. They thought that, having the usual structure for a pilot, which involves having a lot of exposition in the beginning and a kind of a cliffhanger at the end, so that you build up that audience and you convince the network to carry the show through the first season, wasn't going to be really appropriate for the kind of story that they wanted to tell. So when they approached Netflix about it and they explained this dilemma to them, they said, things are probably going to start a little bit slow. We're going to build the tension. We're going to build the story. And it's not the way that networks typically do it, but it's the way that we really want to do it to conserve, the creativity and the energy of the show. Netflix actually did something incredible. They took a look at their data and they took a look at three variables that they thought might, sort of give them an insight into who would watch the show and how many people would watch the show. And so they basically did a little Venn diagram of the current Netflix users who enjoyed the original British version of House of Cards, people who enjoyed Kevin Spacey movies, and people who enjoyed the director David Fincher's movies. And they said, it's actually pretty incredible. We think that there's an audience for this, and we're going to take you on. And in fact, Kevin Spacey has credited them with having not so much the guts, although it was a very gutsy move, but this faith that the data was telling them something right. and that there was an audience out there for the show who would watch it and who would be involved, even though the pacing would be initially slow. So Netflix took the bet, and Kevin Spacey and the director were very, very grateful. And they went on to produce 2 seasons of an award-winning show, and now a big flagship for original programming for Netflix. So that's a great example of changing the way that something's always been done. And it's an example that a lot of networks are now looking toward to understand, how can they craft news stories and present news stories to the same audiences. The next example that I want to take you through is an example that involves looking at the familiar with new eyes. And this, I feel, is very powerful because when you think about it, the world that we live in now today, there's a lot that essentially now has a data skeleton, if you will. Behind what you're seeing, there's data being collected, and often it's not being analyzed. But if you collect it and you know how to manipulate it, you can change almost what you're looking at and what you're doing. And one seminal example of this is a company, Coach, which many of you might be familiar with. So one incredible thing that Coach did is, if you take a look at what they're selling here, the leather racer jacket, it comes in 2 colors. Right now it's at the Bordeaux color. You could also switch it to the camel color. And what Coach used to do is, with you're browsing their online store, you look at this jacket, they would recommend a series of accessories to go along with the jacket. And the usual way that they would do this is they would have this anchor product, the jacket, and they would go to some of their designers and ask their opinions about what would match with this jacket. What else do we have in our product portfolio that goes with this jacket that we can recommend to folks who are browsing for our products online. So as you can imagine, it was a bit of a laborious process, and it relied on the opinion of one designer. However good he or she may have been, it was still hard to nail down. But some enterprising manager came along and realized that often what got matched was based on color. And color can be reduced to pixels on a screen, and each pixel carries, a number attached to them. And if you could figure out a pattern, an algorithm that expressed the tastes of the designers who were making these suggestions, and you linked it to, the particular color of the matches that were being suggested, you could essentially have a recommendation engine that runs on its own. All right, so if you have this Bordeaux jacket that might, be paired with a white bracelet, for example, that's just a matter of optimizing for an algorithm based with the pixel number of what the color of the products that are being presented. So actually, that's essentially what they did. They stopped. Well, they not quite stopped, but they drew away from asking the designers explicitly every time there was a new, jacket or pants or coat being released. And they started relying more on this algorithm, and something quite incredible happened. Pretty quickly, they had a 5% revenue uplift in the accessories being sold with every product that was browsed. And that's quite remarkable, especially if you consider the price of this leather jacket. I mean, a 5% revenue lift is amazing. So that was a matter of taking a look at something that was very familiar, like this leather jacket of this color, what does it go with? And seeing the data skeleton behind it and knowing how to manipulate it. So it's a phenomenal example. A lot of other companies have picked up on it and are doing the same. The last example that I want to take you through is looking at data with new purpose. So very often, and even more so now, companies and people are collecting more data than they know what to do with. And a lot of that data just sits unanalyzed. And it's quite a shame, but it's understandable, because with this flood of data, it's sometimes there just seems to be no way and no insight that can be gained from the data. But when you have a creative mind and the creativity, and you start looking at the data with a new purpose, actually pretty amazing things can happen. And one example of that is what happened with one of the clients of Splunk. Now, Splunk is an analyzer, a data engine that analyzes machine-generated data. So the type of data that's not generated by a human. In this particular example, the client was a Japanese real estate company that was collecting, among many other things, data on its elevators, the elevators of the buildings that it owned. And as you might imagine, this is not, terribly sexy data. No one was really doing anything with it before. But one of their analysts realized that they were collecting this information, and I think out of curiosity, he dropped it into Splunk and started seeing some interesting patterns. And the more he looked at these patterns, the more ideas came to him about what it might mean that he was looking at. So he compiled some of his assumptions and some of his suggestions in the report, took it to his manager and said, listen, we have this elevator data. There's some interesting stuff going on. And I think from this elevator data, we can extrapolate or we can guess which of our tenants are going to go out of business because they're getting fewer elevator visits during rush hour, during the entire day actually. And even the average weight of the cars that are going up to the floors where these tenants are is lower, indicating that they're perhaps, along with fewer visits, there are fewer people making those visits. And the analyst said, this could be useful information for trying to figure out when one of our tenants is about to vacate so that we as a real estate company can turn that property around very quickly. And luckily, this manager was very open to this suggestion, monitored in the next few months the tenants that had emerged as red flags, like possible tenants that would vacate. And pretty much the idea panned out. Those tenants, did have to break their lease for a variety of reasons. Business wasn't going so well. And they did have to vacate, and the manager had other tenants lined up. And with that, they saved themselves quite a bit of money from filling that vacancy very quickly. And what it took was an enterprising analyst who looked at, the data that was being generated with a new purpose. He said to himself, this data can tell me something that perhaps, a story that perhaps it's never told, or a story that perhaps we could never guess because we didn't have this data before, which is quite incredible. So now that you perhaps have an idea that you might have to see the world differently in order to, make decisions differently with data, the next big step, and I think that this is a particularly critical one for MBA students and MBA graduates and anyone who's in a business management position without a technical background, is basically to see yourself differently. And this is quite hard to do. And I'm going to take you through my own example of what it required, for me to see myself differently, to become the kind of person who enjoys working with data, who sees a lot of potential with data. So here is a look at my college transcript. I think this was my sophomore year. By then I had decided I was going to study economics. And if you take a close look, especially in the middle, there, Math 1A Introduction to Calculus, a B- is not an impressive grade. I was really scraping through. Didn't do that much better in econometrics. So basically here, the story that's getting told is I am not a naturally, quantitatively talented person. And really I was slogging through the quantitative requirements. I really was interested more in like the economic theory rather than, grounded in facts and figures and such, because for me, the math of it just didn't make sense. I wasn't terribly interested. And I did what I could to study a subject that I thought was fascinating. By senior year, I had fulfilled a lot of my requirements, and I started, taking some of the classes that I was really interested in. And those classes happened to be language classes. So that year, I took German and French, and I did remarkably better than in any of the math classes that I had ever taken in college. And what sort of shocked me about this when I was thinking, how can I be an analyst, a student, someone who's attracted to data, given that I was so bad at math? Let's be quite clear, I will never be a dynamo in data. I will never be a true data scientist. I'm a business person at heart who enjoys data. But to me, the answer was right here in this transcript. I really like to study language, and the sort of discipline that it takes to, begin and develop and eventually master a language is often the same sort of discipline that you need to have to approach the process of data collection, manipulation, and analysis. You really have to be comfortable with ambiguity. You have to be comfortable with not understanding exactly what it is that you're learning at that moment, but understanding that it's a fundamental building block to greater insight. And you have to appreciate logic, and you have to appreciate illogical things. When you're learning a new language and you don't quite understand the idioms, and you don't quite understand the grammatical structure, you have to almost overcome an instinct to reject the things that you're learning so that you can actually, immerse yourself in the language. So whenever, later on in years when I was working, saw some data that just defied my understanding of a business problem or of a business or of the world even. And I just wanted to instinctively push it away because it didn't align with what I understood to be, factual until then. I sort of felt like I did when I was studying a language, and my instinct was to push that understanding away and revert to what I knew about English, for example. But this, to me, was a sort of a fundamental insight that, if you have the discipline to do something hard and to overcome instincts, and you appreciate logic and the elegance of ambiguity, you will be in good shape as a data-driven manager, because essentially those are a lot of the same skills that are required. And over the summer, actually, when I was between my first and second years of business school, I had an opportunity to interview a lot of alumni at HBS who were working in analytics, because I was fascinated, because they came out of HBS, most of them without a technical background of any kind. And now they found themselves in careers where, data was not only in daily use, but perhaps it was the product that was, the end product. Something that they had to manage and produce every day. So I asked them a series of questions, and I got great insights from them that I wanted to share with you. The first one is what I learned about discipline and what I just spoke about a little bit from Alex Bain, who's now a manager at Facebook. And, he essentially said, a lot of people are intimidated by the process of learning data manipulation. So he references here Python, which is a programming language that's often used in data science. And he says, he actually picked up Python quite a bit, even though he's in a managerial position now, and I doubt that he works with it every day, but it's something that he felt was critical to his understanding of how his business worked and what his engineers were doing. And he said, the process of learning is just like learning French. And if you haven't learned French, it's not because you're a dumb person, it's because you're a person who hasn't studied French. But the discipline required for it is the same. You don't have to have an innate talent. I'm sure it helps if you do for, learning programming languages, but you don't have to have that talent to be able to get a lot out of it. The next great thing that I heard was about creativity. And this is from a recent alum who's now a bona fide data scientist at Apple. And he was telling me about data visualizations, and this was the moment when he realized that, having excellent data visualizations, it really does catapult you to a special place in the organization, because you get pegged as someone who can communicate important insights well. And often when you do that and, you leave a document behind that people admire, they pass it around and they pass it along. And having your name attached to that is just a great way to start a career. So he wasn't familiar with how to, render data visualizations very well, but he taught himself because he saw that as a pathway to getting noticed. And I think that was a very important insight for him, and certainly for me. And it should be to anyone who's looking to not even, be known as a data man or woman, but be known as someone who, is very good at presenting those insights. The next thing I heard about, data use in a business environment by non-technical folks was this idea of communication. So when you're thinking about, I'm an MBA student, or I'm about to graduate from the MBA, what role can I, realistically have in an organization that's data-centered, data-focused, or wants to move in that direction? Well, one of the biggest roles you could play is being the link between the team that's very technical, your statisticians, your computer programmers, the folks who consider themselves your data scientists, and the ones who execute the business strategy. Because in many organizations today, that link just doesn't exist. And bridging those two teams is absolutely critical. So Rebecca Wall, who's now a partner at McKinsey, said that this is the biggest gap that she sees in organizations, and also the biggest opportunity for people to come in and make a very large difference in the organization they're working in. The last thing I want to share with you are the results of a question that I always ask the alumni every time I get a chance to speak to them. And it was the last question. I would ask them, what facet of the world today, like what sector, what industry, what company perhaps, could be improved with data? Where do you see the most need? Where do you see an opportunity for the most impact? And they all had very different ideas about it. As you can see, we have public utilities, we have primary education, we have customer service operations. And this amazed me a little bit because this, it's kind of a tough question, but it didn't stump anyone. They all had very good reasons as why they thought that data could make an impact in these fields. And you could see that they just had a curiosity about, they saw, for example, how public utilities work, where the inefficiencies might be, and how that could be addressed with data. And here I think this is the most powerful part of being data-driven managers, having that curiosity and having the imagination to think about, the things that we addressed when we were talking about how to see the world differently. Like I said before, there's an unprecedented volume of data, and we as managers, as people, as humans, at a very basic level, haven't figured out how to get our hands around it. And we're just at the very beginning of what I feel is a revolution in business. But, being able to turn that, from a trend to a revolution is going to require a lot of curiosity and a lot of imagination. With that being said, I want to give you a little glimmer of what you can become, or the things that you could do when you have these two things aligned, when you start seeing the world differently and you start seeing yourself differently. You can very realistically expect that you're going to be able to produce and consume information better than you ever could. When you start investing a little bit in even the rudimentary technical tools that you might be able to use in consuming data, and I'm talking really, just Excel, just some very basic programming, you're going to see your productivity increase so much, and you're going to, hopefully, as I did, feel really empowered and really engaged with the data that's being produced by your organization. And I just want to give you an example or a couple of examples of the things that you can expect when you start taking yourself in that direction. So this is a very cool chart that I came across, and as I was reading it, I was like, wow, this is so rich. It conveys so much information, and it does it so well and so clearly. And the more I was taking a look at it, I was asking myself, I wonder how this was made. I wonder how the information was collected. And I realized, I don't know exactly how that happened, what were the steps that led to this particular chart that, to me, has a lot of impact, and I imagine it did on the readers of this particular chart. But I do know that if you have an Excel, a spreadsheet, an internet connection, in about 20 minutes, and just, the most basic data visualization tool, even, Paint will do, you can make something like this. And you just can convey a lot of information. As I was mentioning before with the creativity, there are a lot of, excellent tools that have been developed, over the last few decades, different types of charts, different types of graphs that convey information really well. But I think what you're seeing, nowadays is people getting very creative. They're merging, this technical ambitions, technical analysis and capabilities with, design talent to create visuals like these that convey a lot of very rich information. So, as I said before, when you start taking yourself in that direction, this is an example of something that you might be able to do. And as Taka from Apple mentioned, when you get your name attached to good work like this, you get known in your organization. The next thing I want to mention, and this is the last thing actually, is a very important one that probably is a little bit underrated, especially when we talk about data. Now, the thing with data is that when you know how to manipulate it, you can manipulate it to ends that, aren't necessarily truthful, let's say, or can be misleading. And when you become a little bit more experienced in how to produce and consume data, you're going to be able to understand exactly when you're being misled and how you're being misled, and you're going to be able to make informed decisions based on that. So this is a keynote presentation by Tim Cook, current CEO of Apple, and you'll notice that he's showing the cumulative iPhone sales. The thing with cumulative sales, charts of any kind, is that they might not really convey the information that you think they're conveying. Because it's cumulative, it's always going to go up as long as sales are going up. But it doesn't say anything about the quarterly sales. And so if you overlay here the same chart like Tim Cook is presenting with the actual quarterly sales information for Apple, you'll see that the quarterly sales are actually going down. And you might be able to guess this from the slope of the graph, but you really wouldn't know the magnitude. And you see that the magnitude, in some ways, is quite stark, right? So he's trying to mask a little bit of unpalatable information in the keynote. But you, as a sort of diligent and savvy consumer of information, might be able to point that out really quickly. So that is it for the presentation. Want to welcome you again to the future of business, and I hope you get a good sense of what it means to use data in business. As I promised, and as you might have noticed by now, we didn't really talk about big data, what it means to work with billions of records, gigabytes of information. And that's because I think, as important as that is, the first step is just getting comfortable with data of any size, small data, medium data, big data. And I hope this presentation has helped you do that a little bit better. And I encourage you to explore more about big data as you develop as a manager. Thank you very much.